I did not fall in love with him the way women describe love in novels. There were no lightning strikes, no cinematic moments where the world paused and my heart recognized its destiny. What happened to me was quieter, more dangerous. I trusted him first. Love came later, like an infection you don't notice until it's already in your blood. This is my story. And before anyone decides who the villain is, I want it clear. I did not begin as a woman seeking revenge. I began as a woman seeking truth. The first time I saw Arav, he was standing where people usually don't stand unless they want to be noticed. But he wasn't trying to be noticed at all. It was a charity gala, one of those sterile gatherings where wealth dresses up as virtue and everyone pretends they are not measuring one another's worth in silent calculations. I had been dragged by my cousin, who believed social visibility was a form of survival. I believed survival was something quieter. Arav stood near the balcony doors, not interacting, not scanning the room like a predator or a performer. He looked paused, as if he had stepped out of a life mid-sentence. That should have been my first warning. I noticed his hands before his face. Long fingers, restless, tapping against the rim of a crystal glass he never drank from. A man who attends an event and refuses its indulgences is either deeply disciplined or hiding something. When our eyes met, he didn't smile immediately. Most men do. It's reflexive, practiced. He studied me first, briefly, like he was checking whether I was real. Then he nodded, a gesture so restrained it felt intimate. I looked away. I have always been careful with first impressions. My mother taught me that attraction is often just curiosity wearing perfume, and curiosity can be fatal. Yet an hour later, he was beside me. "I don't belong here," he said quietly, as if confessing a crime. I laughed, because it sounded rehearsed and sincere at the same time. Neither do I. That was our first lie, shared and harmless. We spoke about unimportant things at first, the terrible music, the performative speeches, the way people mistook presence for contribution. His voice was calm, measured, with an accent I couldn't immediately place. When I asked where he was from, he hesitated. "Everywhere," he said. I should have pressed him. I didn't. Because there was something in his eyes then, a weariness that mirrored my own, and when two tired people meet, they don't interrogate, they rest. Our affair did not begin romantically. That is another misconception people have about stories like mine. It began intellectually. We met for coffee 3 days later, after a short exchange of messages that were polite to the point of caution. He chose the cafe, a quiet place. No mirrors, no photographs on the walls, no staff hovering. I noticed these things because I had learned to. "Why here?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't like places that demand performance." That answer satisfied me then. We spoke for hours about books, philosophy, power, and the strange loneliness that comes from being capable but unseen. He listened the way rare listeners do, not waiting to respond, but absorbing. When he spoke, he did so precisely, as if words cost him something. I remember thinking, this man has learned to be careful with truth. Again, I admired it instead of fearing it. He never asked intrusive questions. He never touched me. When we parted, there was no expectation implied, no lingering pressure disguised as politeness. He walked away without turning back. That night, I replayed our conversation, not searching for romance, but for inconsistency. I found none. And that disturbed me more than any red flag would have. Over the following weeks, Erev became a constant in my life, subtle but steady. He didn't overwhelm me with presence. He appeared when invited, disappeared when not. He never demanded explanations for my absences or emotional fluctuations. Men like that are dangerous because they make autonomy feel safe. When we finally crossed the line into intimacy, it was unceremonious. No declarations, no promises, just a shared silence that felt heavier than words. Afterwards, as he lay beside me, staring at the ceiling, I asked him something I hadn't planned to. "What are you afraid of?" He didn't answer immediately. "Being known," he said finally. I felt a chill, not because the answer was wrong, but because it was too correct. "Why?" I asked. He turned to me then, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something unguarded. Not vulnerability, calculation stripped bare. "Because people only want to know you so they can decide how to use you." I should have recognized that sentence for what it was, a philosophy forged in betrayal. Instead, I took it as intimacy. Suspicion doesn't arrive as panic. It arrives as discomfort. For me, it began with time. Arav was precise about many things: speech, plans, boundaries. But time around him felt elastic. Days blurred, dates shifted. He remembered details with frightening accuracy, yet occasionally forgot entire events as if they had never occurred. Once, I mentioned a woman he had introduced me to at a dinner. His brow furrowed. "That never happened," he said gently. I laughed, assuming confusion. He did not laugh back. "I would remember," he insisted. That night, I lay awake replaying the memory. I remembered the woman's earrings, her laugh, the way Arab's hand rested on the back of her chair, too familiar for someone he barely knew. Memory is a dangerous thing when love is involved. It bends easily. So I told myself I was mistaken. That was my second major error.
The first crack widened when I discovered he had lied about something trivial: his birthday. I had planned a quiet dinner, nothing extravagant. When I mentioned the date casually weeks earlier, he corrected me. "It's actually the following week," he said. Later, by chance, I found an old document in his study, carelessly left, which, in hindsight, was itself a misdirection. His birth date was clearly printed, the earlier date. I stared at it for a long time, trying to rationalize the inconsistency. People lie about age. People forget paperwork. But this felt different. Not defensive, not embarrassed, intentional. When I asked him directly, he smiled. "That document is wrong," he said easily. "How?" "Clerical error. It happens." "Why didn't you tell me?" He stepped closer, brushed a strand of hair from my face. "Because," he said softly, "some truths invite unnecessary questions." That was the moment I stopped loving him blindly, and the moment I began observing.
I did not confront him. I did not accuse him. I did what intelligent women do when they sense danger wrapped in charm. I watched. I noticed how his phone never faced upward, how calls came at odd hours and ended abruptly, how he sometimes disappeared emotionally for days, returning calm and affectionate, as if nothing had happened. Most telling of all, he never introduced me to his past, No childhood stories, no long-term friends, no history beyond carefully curated fragments. People without a past are either deeply wounded or expertly constructed. I began documenting things, not obsessively, but methodically. Dates, names, locations, contradictions, and slowly a shape emerged. Not of another woman, not of betrayal in the conventional sense, but of a man living parallel lives, intersecting, controlled, intentional. And I, foolishly, was one of them. The night everything changed, he asked me a question he had never asked before. "Would you trust me," he said, "even if you discovered something terrible about me?" I studied his face, calm, open, expectant. "That depends," I replied, "on whether you believe love excuses harm." Something flickered then, annoyance perhaps, or relief. He kissed my forehead. "I knew you were different," he said. That sentence would later echo in my mind like a verdict. Because I was different, and difference, as he would learn, cuts both ways. Fear came later. First came clarity. This was not a man hiding from his past. This was a man maintaining several presents. I photographed nothing. I touched nothing longer than necessary. I returned everything exactly as it had been. Then I left the apartment and walked until my legs trembled, until the city lights blurred into something unreal. By the time Arav returned, I had made a decision. I would not leave. Leaving would have been mercy, and mercy, I understood now, was not something he had ever offered anyone else. When he walked through the door, travel-worn but composed, he embraced me as if nothing existed between us but affection. I let him. I breathed him in. I memorized the weight of his arms, the rhythm of his heart. "You're quiet," he observed. "Just tired," I replied. He studied my face for a moment longer than usual. Then he nodded, satisfied, or pretending to be. That night, he slept easily. I did not. I began constructing my revenge the same way he constructed his life, patiently, invisibly, and without emotion. Revenge, I learned, is not born from rage. Rage is loud, reckless, ineffective. Revenge is born from understanding. I needed to know what he was, not morally, but functionally. What systems did he rely on? Who protected him? Who feared him? Who believed in him? So I became smaller. I stopped challenging him intellectually. I deferred more. I asked for advice I did not need. I allowed him to feel superior, indispensable. Men like Arav relax when they believe they are admired without scrutiny. In that relaxation, he began to slip. He mentioned organizations without context. He spoke of leverage, of assets, of containment. He once joked darkly that truth was a currency best laundered. I smiled at the joke. Inside, I cataloged it. The first name I traced led me to a shell company that didn't exist on paper but existed everywhere else. The second led to a man who had disappeared 6 years earlier, presumed dead, but whose financial activity suggested otherwise. Arav was not a criminal in the traditional sense. He was a broker of outcomes. People came to him when laws were inconvenient, when reputations needed reshaping, when problems required erasure rather than resolution. He did not pull triggers. He pulled strings. And I was sleeping beside him. The most painful realization was not that he was dangerous. It was that he chose me deliberately. I fit too well into his life to be accidental. Educated, discreet, emotionally intelligent, with a professional profile that attracted no suspicion. I was camouflage. When I finally accepted that truth, something inside me hardened permanently. Love, when it turns, does not simply die, it transforms into something colder, sharper, and far more enduring. I stopped asking myself why he lied. I started asking how to dismantle him, and the answer, slowly and beautifully, began to reveal itself. Because men like Arav believe they control narratives, they never expect the story to be told by the woman who learned to listen better than they ever spoke. By the time I understood the full shape of his world, I had already accepted my place inside it. Not as a victim, not as an accomplice, but as a variable he had not accounted for. Arav believed in systems. He trusted patterns, incentives, leverage. He did not believe in chaos, and he certainly did not believe in sentiment. That was his blind spot. He mistook emotional intelligence for emotional weakness. He thought love dulled perception. He never considered that love could sharpen it. I learned his rhythms the way one learns a language, not through translation, but through immersion. I knew when he would wake before the alarm. I knew which silences meant danger and which meant boredom. I knew when his calm was real and when it was an act designed to disarm. And I knew when he was lying to me without saying a single false word. There was a woman whose name surfaced twice in 2 months. Only twice. The first time, it was during a conversation about logistics, someone who had mishandled communication. The second time, it appeared in a passing remark about loyalty. The tone changed both times. That was enough. I did not search for her directly. That would have been obvious, and obviousness was a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I traced the edges, financial records adjacent to Arav's shell companies, professional overlaps, social echoes. She had been a consultant once, brilliant, quiet, the kind of woman who delivered results without demanding recognition. She vanished 3 years earlier. Not legally dead, just erased. No social media activity, no professional footprint, no public mourning. People do not disappear like that unless someone ensures they do. I asked Arav about her casually one evening, my voice neutral, my interest feigned. She moved abroad, he said, without hesitation. Did you trust her? I asked. He paused, just a fraction too long. I trusted her until she became unpredictable. I nodded, as if satisfied. Unpredictable. The word repeated in my head for days. I began to see the pattern then. Women did not leave his orbit intact. They exited quietly, reputationally diminished, professionally displaced, or entirely removed. He did not punish betrayal with anger. He neutralized it with efficiency. I wondered briefly what my own exit would have looked like if I had never noticed the cracks. That thought did not frighten me. It clarified me. The turning point came when he involved me, truly involved me, for the first time. It was subtle. He asked for my opinion on a situation that seemed hypothetical, a client facing exposure, a journalist asking the wrong questions, a choice between discrediting the source or redirecting attention. I considered my response carefully. I'd make the truth boring, I said. Scandal dies when it loses drama. His eyes lit up, not with desire, but with recognition. Yes, he said softly. Exactly. That was the moment I realized I was no longer merely camouflage. I was being evaluated. From that night on, he tested me. Small disclosures, ethical gray zones framed as intellectual exercises. I responded with restraint, with intelligence, with just enough moral flexibility to appear useful but not alarming. I let him believe I was aligning with him. In reality, I was aligning against him with precision. The first step of my revenge was not destruction, it was dependency. I positioned myself as the one person who understood the complexity of his work without judgment. I listened when others demanded results. I offered insight without seeking credit. I became indispensable in the quietest way possible. Men like Arav did not fear enemies. They fear obsolescence. So I made myself necessary. He began to consult me more frequently. He shared concerns he once handled alone. He allowed me into strategic conversations under the guise of trust, never realizing trust was the lever I needed. I learned the names of his clients, the weaknesses of his alliances, the invisible threads holding his empire together. Most importantly, I learned his greatest vulnerability. He believed he was untouchable because he believed no one would ever tell the story. Everything he did relied on silence, legal silence, financial silence, emotional silence. He operated in the space between what could be proven and what could be spoken. So I began preparing my voice, not publicly, not yet, privately. I documented everything, not digitally, never digitally, paper, memory, redundancy. I memorized account flows, meeting dates, contradictions in testimony. I rehearsed explanations until they were instinctual. And still, I waited. Revenge rushed is revenge ruined. The opportunity arrived disguised as intimacy. One night, after too much wine and an unguarded laugh, Arav told me something he had never told anyone else. "There was a time," he said, staring into his glass, "when I thought control was about force. I was wrong. Control is about choice. You take choices away quietly, and people thank you for the relief." I touched his hand. "Do you ever regret it?" He smiled, almost kindly. "No," he said. "Regret is for people who imagine alternatives." That was the sentence that ended him, because I was imagining alternatives very clearly. The next morning I began the final phase, not the act of revenge itself, but its inevitability. I reached out to someone from his past, not a victim, a survivor. And for the first time since I met Arav, I felt something close to peace. The woman I contacted did not answer immediately. I had expected silence, perhaps fear, perhaps disbelief. What I did not expect was the restraint. She waited 3 days before replying, and when she did, her message was only 4 words long. "I wondered when you'd notice." Her name was Mira. We met in a place chosen for anonymity, not secrecy, a public library cafe where people spoke in low voices and nobody looked at anyone long enough to remember them. When she walked in, I recognized her instantly, not from photographs, but from familiarity. She carried herself the way I had begun to, alert without being tense, composed without being open. She did not hug me, she did not thank me. She sat across from me and studied my face with professional detachment. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," I replied. "Not long enough to stop him earlier." She nodded, accepting that distinction. "Then you're still useful." That was how our alliance began, not with solidarity, but with strategy. Mira had not disappeared by accident. She had been pushed, slowly and systematically, until staying visible cost her everything. Her career dismantled through anonymous complaints. Her credibility eroded through carefully planted inconsistencies. Her personal life destabilized by rumors that were never traceable but always persuasive. By the time she realized what was happening, the narrative had already solidified. She survived by leaving the field entirely. He doesn't destroy you all at once, she said calmly, stirring her tea. He shrinks your world until escape feels like your idea. I listened, I learned, I adjusted my plan. What Mira gave me was not information, I already had much of that. What she gave me was perspective. She understood his endgames. She knew how he closed loops. She knew where he became careless. He hates unpredictability, she said, but more than that, he hates losing authorship. He needs to believe every outcome traces back to him. That was the key. You do not defeat a man like Arav by confronting him. You defeat him by letting him believe he is winning until he realizes the victory is hollow and irreversible. I returned to him changed, but subtly so. More affectionate, more present. I allowed myself to appear emotionally invested again, as if the earlier distance had been a phase. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. But he interpreted it the way men like him do, as surrender. "You've been different," he said one evening, pleased rather than suspicious. I was afraid, I admitted, of how much I cared. He smiled. Care is a liability, but it's a beautiful one. I let that sentence pass without response. Behind the scenes, Mira and I began building what he could not see, a parallel narrative, one that did not accuse, one that did not expose outright, one that simply existed, waiting. We reached out to people quietly, former collaborators, journalists who had been nudged off stories, professionals whose careers had stalled inexplicably after crossing the wrong interests. Not with demands, not with revelations, with questions. Patterns emerged quickly when people realized they were not alone. Arav's greatest protection had been isolation. He kept his victims separate, convinced each of them that their downfall was personal, unique, deserved. We replaced that lie with connection. The risk was immense. If he suspected coordination, the consequences would have been severe. So we moved slowly, always one step behind his attention, always beneath his threshold for alarm. Then he made his mistake. He involved me in a decision that required moral commitment. A client, politically visible, legally insulated, needed a problem erased. Not redirected, erased. The collateral damage would be substantial. Careers, families, reputations, the usual. "I need your perspective," he said, "not professionally, personally." I looked at him then, truly looked at him, and felt nothing. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you understand cost, and because you won't flinch." I smiled. "I won't," I said, "but I need time." He agreed. That night I did not sleep, not because of guilt, but because of precision. I understood then that my revenge could no longer remain passive. Waiting was no longer enough. I had to act. The next day I gave him my answer. "I think you should proceed, but not the way you're planning." I outlined an alternative, cleaner, subtler, less traceable. It impressed him. He adopted it without question. What he did not know was that the alternative required one thing he could not control: documentation. I ensured that the decision trail, for the first time, could not be fully erased, not publicly visible, not incriminating on its own, but undeniable when aligned with the rest. That was the moment the trap closed. From then on, everything accelerated. Mira's network expanded, stories aligned, timelines synchronized. What once looked like coincidence began to resemble architecture. Arav sensed pressure, but misread its source. He tightened control. He questioned allies. He demanded loyalty in ways that exposed his fear. And fear makes men sloppy. The final fracture came unexpectedly, violently quiet. One evening he asked me, "If everything collapsed tomorrow, would you stay?" I did not answer immediately. "Would you?" he pressed. I met his gaze and spoke the truth for the first time since I met him. "No." Something broke behind his eyes. Not anger, not betrayal. Recognition. He realized then that I had never belonged to him, but by the time he understood that, it was already too late, because the story was no longer his to control. I did not watch Era fall the way people imagine downfall. There was no courtroom revelation, no dramatic arrest captured by cameras, no single headline that spoke his name aloud. Men like him are never undone publicly all at once. Their punishment is quieter, more fitting. It began with silence. Calls unanswered, meetings postponed indefinitely, clients suddenly cautious, then distant. Allies who once returned messages within minutes, now replying through intermediaries, or not at all. His world did not collapse. It hollowed. At first, he treated it as friction, temporary resistance. He believed control could be reasserted with pressure. He increased demands, tightened leverage, issued warnings disguised as reassurance. And in doing so, he exposed himself. Every aggressive move confirmed patterns that had already been documented. Every threat validated stories that once sounded exaggerated. Every attempt to contain damage widened the cracks. I stayed. That was the cruelest part, though I did not intend it to be cruel. I stayed with him through the erosion, calm and present, offering the same steady companionship I always had. I watched him recalibrate again and again, trying to understand where the power was leaking from, never suspecting the person sitting across from him at dinner. One night, long after midnight, he finally asked the question he had been avoiding. "How long have you known?" he said. I did not pretend not to understand. "Long enough," I replied. He studied my face, searching for emotion he could exploit. Anger, heartbreak, bitterness. He found none. What he saw instead was something far more unsettling. Resolution. "You could have left," he said quietly. "Yes," I agreed, but then the story would have stayed unfinished. He laughed then, softly, without humor. "You think this ends me?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, "I think it ends your certainty." That was when he understood. Not fully. Men like Arav never fully understand defeat. But he grasped enough to feel fear, not of punishment, but of irrelevance. He had built his life on being necessary, feared, indispensable. Now decisions were being made without him. Narratives were forming beyond his reach. People he had once reduced to silence were speaking, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Their stories did not accuse, they aligned, and alignment is devastating. The last time I saw him, he was smaller somehow. Not physically, but existentially. His confidence had not shattered, it had thinned, stretched too far to hold its shape. "You loved me," he said, not as a question. "Yes," I answered. "Then why?" he asked. I stood, picked up my coat, and looked at him for the final time. "Because love is not permission," I said, "and silence is not consent." I walked away without waiting for his response. In the months that followed, his name faded from relevance. Not erased, just neutralized. Opportunities stopped appearing. Doors remained closed. His reputation became ambiguous, then inconvenient, then quietly avoided. No one ever confronted him directly. No one needed to. As for me, I did not emerge victorious in the way stories promise. Revenge does not grant triumph, it grants closure. I lost the woman I was before him, the one who trusted without verification, who believed intelligence was protection enough. But I gained something far more durable: agency. I learned that suspicion is not paranoia when it is earned, that love does not excuse harm, no matter how softly it speaks, and that the most effective revenge is not destruction, but rebalancing the power that was stolen. I tell this story now not to warn and not to boast. I tell it because stories like his thrive on silence, and because I survived him, not by becoming cruel, but by becoming precise. That is the ending he never anticipated, and the one I chose.